Everyone's heard of the Nazca Line, but what do you know about their civilization? Well, in this video, I want to talk about that civilization. Yes, I'm going to talk about the lines too, but I want to give you a broader picture of who they were and where they came from. First, their origins. They didn't show up out of nowhere. They're actually the direct descendants of a culture we call Paracas. Paracas culture lived on the coast of Peru, well south of what modern-day Lima is, but they lived in very simple cities, and those cities had little pyramids with ramps in them, but they're not really famous for those cities. What they're famous for is their mummy bundles. There were these shaft tombs found very close to the coast and away from their communities, where they dumped hundreds of these mummy bundles with a body inside, and it was wrapped in all these textiles, and in between the textiles were all sorts of ceramics, gold, all sorts of treasures. So, I mean, really just like each one of them was a treasure bag for archaeologists, and there were hundreds of them found. The bodies on the inside had those famous elongated skulls. They also had severed heads along with them in the graves. Sometimes those were buried. Sometimes there were mummy bundles of just heads. Very, very odd. If you look at the iconography, especially on the textiles, you see a theme again and again and again, which is priests or perhaps the deity himself, the Fang deity. There are people dressed up as the Fang deity. Perhaps some of them are actually him. But they have the classic goggle eyes and the fangs, and they have tails, and they're walking around with a lot of severed heads, which is what they do. So Paracas culture was rolling along, and it starts in 900 BCE and goes to about 100 BCE when we suspect a really bad cycle of El Niños, we call them mega El Niños, hit that coast and wiped out their cities and agricultural abilities. And because of that, that culture migrated further inland, still in the desert areas, but right up against the mountains where the rivers come out, and they settled in the Nazca Valley area. It's easy to see that those Nazca people are the descendants of Paracas. They start up right about 100 BC, just as Paracas depopulates Nazca Valley. Today it's about 3 hours by bus between the two areas. That area swells in population. And they're doing the same sort of thing. They're building little cities with pyramids, with ramps instead of staircases. They're making the same kinds of art in terms of iconography. We see that Fang deity everywhere. We see severed heads. They are making fancier pottery eventually, things that are shinier. But essentially, in terms of the themes of the art, same stuff. They're also burying mummies, but no longer in those shaft, bell-shaped tombs. Now they're in rectangular pits, but they're still mummies, still bundled, and there's even more severed heads. And of course, the Fang deity is very, very prevalent in their art. One more thing, their heads are also elongated. So we have this physical connection between Paracas, who began that elongated head tradition, and the Nazca, who continued it up until around 600 CE. Now, the Nazca moved into the Nazca Valley because they needed a reliable water source for their agricultural crops, mostly corn. And the Nazca Valley had the very strong Nazca River running through it. So that was good for a start. But as civilization expanded, they were well outside that area close to the river. And that's where they developed what I'm most impressed of by their civilization. And that was their Puquios system. It was an aqueduct system. They dug these deep tunnels all the way back to the mountain edge. And there they connected to big, strong springs coming out of the mountains from underneath. So these long tunnels led back out into their fields. And all along those tunnels, they created wells that are called Puquios. The Puquios are these wide-mouthed wells with spiral staircases going down. And then at the bottom, there's a place to connect to the water running through the aqueduct system. The tunnels underneath there are tall enough for a man to walk through in maintenance. and they spread miles out into the desert. Off of those, offshot other irrigation canals, and they collectively watered acres and acres and acres of land. That was really the most sophisticated thing, in my opinion, that the Nazca did. People don't really appreciate that much, but for my money, that is amazing ancient engineering. Okay, well, how about those Nazca Lines? Well, they are definitely impressive, amazing things. Out on a desert plain where it never ever rains, these huge images, these lines, these animals, these geometric shapes are all over this huge plain. I've flown over them at least 6 times now, and I've also flown over the Pulpa line, so I've seen them from the air a lot. And the immediate thing that hits your eyes when you do is that there are thousands of these lines, and they're not separated. They overlap one another. Again and again, you see partial lines that are overlapped by bigger shapes. So it's a real spaghetti bowl of a thing. It doesn't look nice and clean like it does in some of the books or the internet. It's a pile of lines on top of lines on top of lines. And their subject matter is all over the place. Most of them are just lines. They're very long lines, hundreds of meters long, but they're simple lines. Then we have things like geometric shapes, and sometimes they're big wide areas that were cleared out. Those are the ones that really look like runways, but they're just these big geometric shapes, sometimes rectangles, sometimes trapezoids, but big long things. The most famous ones are the animal ones, and they're all over the place too. There's 20 or 30 of them at least, and there's a few ones that are humans, but they're all over the place. They're different things. They're not set up in arrangements. They're very much not honoring each other's space. So they look like they were done as one-offs and perhaps as something that was ephemeral. In terms of how they're made, they're actually really, really simple. The plains where they're all located is just a rock field. They're all sitting on this very white sand underneath. So all you need to do is spread those rocks out and reveal the white sand, and presto, you've got a very visible Nazca line. I actually did it myself once, outside of the park, of course, but a few miles away where it was the same kind of landscape. I just got out of the van and I used the side of my tennis shoe and I just kind of wiped things away and I made myself a little rectangle. And it took me 5 minutes to do it. So really, how they made the Nazca Lines, not that hard physically. It's really the planning and perhaps the surveying that it took that's really interesting about it, not how difficult it was to make physically. The most logical thing they could have done is make a scale drawing when it comes to those more complicated forms like animals, and then they go out into the desert and they scale it up. That's basic surveying. If we were doing it today, we'd use stakes and lines, and we'd take, 1 inch on my piece of paper means 10 feet here, and we'd scale it out. And the fact of the matter is that archaeologists have found similar things like that in some of the lines, especially those animal forms. We actually find wooden stakes with string that are old. We also find pottery kind of spread around inside there. So we know that there's human activity going on as they're probably staking out these things and then creating them together. The dates for those stakes and the strings are matching what we see in terms of the Nazca ceramics in those same lines. It runs from about 300 CE to 600 CE. That's when most of those lines were made. At least that's what the artifacts inside of them say. And that means that the Nazca were probably there being Paracas 2.0 for a few centuries before they decided on this amazing practice of creating Nazca Lines. No one really knows why they made the Nazca Lines. There are definitely theories out there. People say that they're made giant so the gods can see them from the skies. Of course, there are those that think they're for the aliens, and some of them are alien landing strips. But all of that is just theory. There's no consensus on exactly why they made them. My personal theory is that they were part of a ritual communal art program that was connected to the festival cycle. There are many examples where communities go out and create art together as part of ritual activity. I think the Nazca Lines were that on a giant scale. There's an interesting site right on the edge of the main Nazca Lines plain called Cahuachi. And it is a city with about 40, 50 buildings, and a lot of them are pyramids with those ramps, but there's no real evidence of community around it. And inside of it, we see a lot of activity that indicates repeated feasting. There are these storerooms that have stacks of plates and serving dishes, and the trash pits have lots of evidence of bones and like mass eating events that are then buried, and those are great for archaeologists. We can date them, we can see what they were eating. There's also a big area that's a cemetery just outside the site, but again, not many houses. So we think that that was the site for the regional Nazca people to gather in to do feasting. There may have been other feasting areas, but that definitely seems like a festival place right next to the Nazca Lines. So if they're already gathering there and doing community-wide events, it makes sense that those same people that were gathered there would be out on the plains making those lines. And the fact that they overlap each other again and again and again. And so, 1 year a group comes in and they make a nice rectangle that's a couple 100 meters long. But then right over it again and again will be other lines or other shapes. They overlap each other, which means that they weren't meant to be honored forever. They were kind of a cyclical thing they did on those plains again and again, which again ties nicely to the idea that they were feasting and then creating the lines. Again, Cahuachi's timeline is just right. It starts maybe a little earlier than 300 CE, but it's abandoned by 600 CE. So, what happened to the Nazca people? Well, in simplest form, the Wari did. The Wari civilization really is what finally rubbed the Nazca out, or at least transformed them into Wari subsidiaries. About 500 CE, the Wari civilization starts developing up in the Andes, not on the plains where the Nazca are. And they build these big cities in the Ayacucho Valley. Eventually, they start spreading out and creating outposts, and they take over Moche lands, they take over the area near Lima. But the first place they go to is the Nazca. They're actually the closest to them. Those other areas are places later on in conquests. But the Nazca were some of the first people that the Wari actually came down and took over in what I think is really Peru's first expansionist empire. But even before the Wari showed up, the Nazca got a little too successful for their own good. More and more population moved farther and farther off the rivers, depending on those aqueduct systems. But those aqueduct systems were being so used that it lowered the water table. And we can see that a lot of them had just run dry and they weren't using them anymore. So the Nazca were already kind of in a fragile place in terms of overreaching their resource capacity, and then the Wari come in. And that is really the end of what we see as purely Nazca people. Of course, the people didn't leave, they were just under new management. Nazca still exists. There's a city there. I visited it many times and it's actually really cool. There's also the airport there where you got to show up daily to get on the list, but every day they're taking tourists up and over the Nazca Lines and the Palpa Lines. Neat experience. But the community is once again facing a crisis, very much like their ancestors, 1400 years earlier faced, in that there are too many people moving into Nazca right now. There's all these groups of squatter communities that are just outside of Nazca proper. They're people that were struggling up in the mountains and have now come down and kind of just globbed onto the side of growing Nazca City. That has caused the water table to lower again. everyone there is suffering a severe lack of water. And a lot of it is taken up by industries like the copper mine industries that are right next door to them. So the Nazca people still exist, but they are also still struggling to keep existing. I've met those modern Nazca folks. I feel for their situation right now, and I hope they find a way to solve it. If you like what I do, please consider supporting me through Patreon. YouTube's ad revenue model sucks. You have to put up with clicking through weird commercials, and creators always get a pittance of the actual revenue. So let's not do that. Patreon is really a much more direct way to support the kind of content that you value. For just $5 a month, you can keep me in this chair instead of out there trying to make a living some other way. I am as cheap as a cup of coffee and considerably less bitter. My Patreon is actually linked to my podcast, Archaeologist, which if you haven't heard that, you might like that too. But here's the link right here to my Patreon through Archaeologist. I'll also put it in my show notes. Thanks for watching. If you like that, you might like these other two videos. Give them a try.